Hello, today is Tuesday, June 8th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. We recently recorded a podcast on the benefits of aggregating your inventory and spend for ILEC POTS lines using an aggregator. You might be thinking, who the heck uses POTS lines today? Well, the ILECs appear to be asking the same question, because we're seeing a disturbing trend in ILEC pricing. On today's podcast, my fellow TC2 directors, Theresa Knutson and Julie Gardner, are going to talk about what the ILECs are doing to drive you away from buying these services. Theresa and Julie have done quite a lot of work with our clients in the ILEC space, so I'm really pleased that they're here to share some of their insights. Okay. Hey, Theresa and Julie, welcome to the podcast. So, Theresa, how about if you give a quick overview of ILEC local spend and the issues that you're seeing?
Sure. Hey, Joe, it's great to be back with you on Staying Connected. Well, first, a couple basics. ILEC stands for Incumbent Local Exchange Carrier. And we are going to discuss POTS lines, which basically stands for Plain Old Telephone Services, hence the acronym POTS. And this service is basically a traditional landline phone system that relies on a physical wire, a landline. In today's world of voice over IP and wireless voice services, you're probably wondering, why are we even talking about landlines today? Well, there's a reason. Businesses still use landlines for a variety of things like security monitoring and elevator safety lines. And believe it or not, some businesses still rely on landlines for their business voice usage. And the reason that we're here to discuss this today is that there's a huge rising cost of these services that's occurring. And it's very normal for carriers to implement price increases in the first half of the year, and we typically expect to see increases in list prices for certain services. This year, the ILEC service prices increases exceeded our expectations in not a good way. An example is that AT&T raised its list rate for POTS services from $279 to $419 per line in mid-March 2021 for the Southeast region. That's a 50% increase. If you have an active AT&T Easy Rate contract for these services, you're likely paying between $30 and $40 a month for a POTS line, and you won't see an increase because you have a contract. But for those who don't have a contract in place or are buying off what we call an MDA, or Master Discount Agreement, you have a set discount off an ever-changing and increasing list rates. You likely saw a huge increase in your ILEC invoices in March.
Wow. So, Julie, that's a huge increase for business customers. I'm just curious, have residential customers seen that same kind of increase?
Great question. And the answer to that is no. Residential POTS lines haven't increased much at all over the same time period. And in fact, the POTS line list rate that costs a business customer $419 a month, as Theresa mentioned, actually costs a residential customer around $30 a month. And this is because the telecom carriers don't attempt these types of price increases on the residential customers because they know that those residential customers will cry out to the PUCs or public utility commissions. So the PUCs are there in each state to protect customers when it comes to service availability and costs. Those customers include business and residential. But when it comes to the business customers, the PUCs don't face the same type of public outcry. There's the general sense that business customers should be smart enough to contract for their services or move to an alternate provider or technology if they see those big price hikes. So as a business customer, you're supposed to be sophisticated enough and understand your bills. But while you may know your monthly charges on your local invoice have skyrocketed, you're going to be hard-pressed to pinpoint exactly why when you look at the actual invoice. And that's because local services typically show up with just a few lines of data on them. There's rarely any breakdown of the monthly recurring costs, and not the breakdown that you'd need at what's called the USOC level. Now, USOC stands for Universal Service Order Code. And for those of you that enjoy telecom acronyms, that's an important one in the local services world. USOC level detail is what you need to determine what you're paying for your local services at that lowest level of detail. Now, the USOCs that you see in that detail are going to correspond to the state-level service guidebooks and publications for the services that you're buying.
You know, we always talk about how billing for telecom and other ICT services is such a mess, and I think there's just another example. So, Theresa, what is an enterprise to do?
Well, earlier in March, we did a podcast on the reasons that companies look to move away from buying services from ILECs directly and move to an aggregator. And clarity of billing is a primary reason. An aggregator gives you USOC level detail, you know the address, you know what you're paying for. So that's a big benefit there. But ILEC services like POTS are governed by, as Julie mentioned, state-specific service guide. And when there's a change to the service guide, you might get a note someplace on your ILEC invoice that notifies you of that change. And most of the time, these notices don't go to the right people within a company. So what happens if you don't have a contract in place for the services, that you see an increase on your invoice. And eventually someone either in your accounts payable, if you have a telecom expense management company, will reach out to IT and procurement and said, hey, this invoice went up by 150% or 125% over the month. And that question takes a few months to get relayed to the right people to actually, understand what's happening and make a determination and a plan to mitigate those cost increases. We can help with that, and we regularly do for our clients.
So Julie, is the only answer to move to an aggregator to sort out this sort of issue?
Well, not necessarily, Joe. If you have an active contract, you're not going to need to move to an aggregator right now, but you need to start considering this and exploring this for the future. So even in that post-SIP world, as Theresa mentioned, many of our clients still use not only POTS lines, but also local PRIs and various other local services. And the big carriers, the big ILECs, have been pushing business customers off of these copper-based technologies. And they're doing that through these annual price increases that we've talked about. For example, if you look at the cost of POTS and PBX trunks in AT&T's 22-state ILEC footprint, over the last 5 years, the list rates have increased around 350%. So what that means for you as a business customer, you will see and expect to see price increases on these services. You'll also start to see takebacks on some of your existing contract provisions and some inflexibility when it comes to your ILEC contract negotiations and renewals.
I remember when the telcos were sort of pushing our clients to get off a frame relay by increasing the pricing and trying to get them to move to MPLS. And I guess what you just described is another example of the telcos just using pricing as your incentive to change technology. What do you think about that, Theresa?
And I think that's absolutely spot on. And it's not just limited to POTS and PBX trunks, but it's a variety of other local services. I have a client who has PRI services from one of the two big U.S. ILECs, and they wanted to actually put those under contract. And they were told that the ILEC is no longer offering contract or custom pricing on PRI services. So what this means is if you have an active PRI agreement and still use those services, do not let those PRI agreements expire. Make sure you're amending and extending, or you will be faced with some really big increases while you work with your IT team to eventually migrate off of these old copper-based technologies and move to like SIP or VoIP services.
It's important to point out that this isn't just a U.S. phenomenon. I have an international client that has a site where their PTT has flat out said that ISDN for its PBX trunks, it's being eliminated. It's kaput. It's being put to bed. So they have no choice but to move to some other solution. So I guess that's just the state of the market. Julie, do you have any final closing thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. Remember to check your local billing. Make sure you understand your contractual positions for local services. As Theresa said, do not let your contracts expire. This is more important now than ever. There are various local service specific reports you can request from your vendor account teams that will get you that USOC level detail that I mentioned earlier. Again, this may be part of your aggregator type reporting, but it's not part of the reporting that you get from your ILEC. So staying on top of this spend, understanding the changes that are happening in this space, that's going to prevent bad surprises for you and your company down the road.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Julie, and thank you as well, Theresa. Now, as you just heard, ILEC local costs are continuing to increase, so you better have a plan for dealing with it. If you'd like to talk to Theresa, Julie, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues about your ILEC local services, please give us a call or send us an email. You can also stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.